For nearly 2,000 years, one name has been synonymous with betrayal: Judas Iscariot, the disciple who sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. But here's the real question: was Judas a living, breathing man, or a narrative invention crafted to explain the unexplainable? Today, we're going to peel back the layers of history and theology to ask the question almost no one asks: did Judas Iscariot actually exist? When I heard about Christianity for the first time, I was 7 years old and I had no idea who Jesus even was. The introduction to Christianity in my upbringing was purely demographic for the most part, and anyhow, I was too young to understand anything theology related. Christians were close to 2 billion people out of 5.5 populating Earth at the time. Of course, I got older and I learned about Jesus from both Islamic and Christian standpoints. The exposure to Christianity was either through Western culture in movies, music, and art, or on a minimal scale through my limited interactions with Christians in the Muslim world. Interestingly, apart from Jesus, I wasn't aware of any Christian figure other than Judas Iscariot, the third most recognizable Christian figure after Jesus and his mother, Mary. For Muslims, there's a spontaneous interest in the character of Judas Iscariot. Islam, for those who don't know, provides an alternate narrative or a revisionist approach to Christianity, in which the most central event of Christology simply didn't occur. According to Muslims, Jesus didn't get crucified, he didn't pay for anyone's sins, and he wasn't even God or the Son of God. Now, when it comes to Judas, he is a very, very critical personality in this framework. Judas was told to have sold Jesus out to the authorities after he had been one of his staunch supporters and close companions. A thing that makes little to no sense regardless of all the theories about his real motives. First, let's start with why I think Judas was simply a fake character injected in the Gospels to help make sense of the disappearance of Jesus. The first reason is his name. One of the popular modern theories that dates back to the 16th century explaining the motives of Judas was that he was affiliated with the Sicarii. The Sicarii was a Jewish resistance group active in the 1st century Roman-occupied Judea. They were known for their fierce opposition to Roman occupation, refusing to pay Roman taxes, and advocating rebellion against the ungodly foreign rule. Fair enough. The reason why many thought that he belonged to them was his name, Iscariot, which sounded pretty close to a Sicarii, a word that came from the Latin word sica, meaning a curved dagger. I was one of the people who believed that Judas Iscariot was a radical zealot who turned Jesus in because Jesus wasn't rebellious enough, and somehow by reporting him to the authorities and getting him captured, it would activate Jesus' messianic nature and trigger a clash with the Romans and the Pharisees. But no, that particular group, the Sicarii, was active several decades after the mission of Jesus. There is no way that that man could have been called Iscariot for that reason. Secondly, that group worked undercover, and there's no way he could have been known publicly as a Sicarii or Iscariot. Thirdly, the Sicarii were so much against the authorities that not only did they target Romans, but also Roman sympathizers and collaborators. They even assassinated Jonathan, the Jewish former high priest, around 56 AD. So there is no way that he would have betrayed someone who was pretty much disliked by the authorities as Jesus. I mean, there is no enough motive here. The earlier and more established naming theory is that Iscariot is a Hebrew composition of two words. The first is Ish, which means man, and the second is Kiryot, a city near Hebron in the southern Judean hills. Ish Kiryot, or the man of Kiryot, is actually not a proper name. This is a descriptor, and not a single Hebrew figure was named in this locative style, as it's not grammatically natural to refer to someone from a place in this manner. The demonym reference to someone from Kiryot or a Kiryothite person would be Kiryoti in Hebrew or Kiryotaya in Aramaic. Judas Iscariot is the only biblical figure whose standard name includes a clear Hebrew-Aramaic compound. It is also the only name that never occurs as a personal name in Jewish history. You can refer to someone like that, but it's never used as a proper name. Even if it was the case, the Greek writers translated each meaning of locative names, like Jesus of Nazareth, becoming Jesus, ho Nazareos, or Mary Magdalene becoming Maria he Magdalene. However, they just kept Judas's name in that weird composition. Greek authors didn't translate it into Greek the same way, which would have been ho anthropos ek Keriot, or the man from Keriot, but kept it in a transliterated form, Iscariotes. And that strange naming caused Christians to theorize about the origin of his name till this very day. My assumption is that the name of Judas was fabricated to blame the Judean establishment of betraying Jesus and rejecting his message. Judas was the only disciple of Jesus that was not from Galilee, a rural part in the country that differed culturally from the temple-centered, urbanized region of Judea. There was another disciple of Jesus with the same name, Judas. That was Judas, son of James. And to distinguish our Judas, he had to have a foreign, Jewish-sounding name with a non-Hellenized sound to it. Other disciples had either Hellenized names or Greek forms of a Semitic name. For example, Cephas became Petros or Peter, Yohanan became John, Yaakov became James, etc. By adding the unnatural name Iscariot, referring to a city in Judea, his identity became both geographically and culturally distinct from the rest of the disciples. The second reason I think Judas did not exist is his motive. Was it the money, really? The most entertaining theory about Judas's motive is that he was a greedy, money-hungry person who did it all for the cash. Now, when you think of him being thrown a pouch of silver, it makes it seem like a fortune back in the days, but actually that wasn't the case at all. This money was barely enough to keep a guy going for about a couple of months back then. And the figure of 30 coins of silver is also pretty symbolic in a way. This figure appeared repeatedly in the Old Testament as a compensation for killing a slave, or the valuation of certain slaves being killed by accident, or what the first century historian Josephus recorded as the price for a non-skilled slave in Roman era sources. Think of a guy coming from the south of Judea all the way to the north, hanging out with Jesus for that long, to eventually sell him out for an amount of money that he probably outspent just by hanging out with him in the first place. Something doesn't add up there. The third reason I think Judas didn't exist is his death. The Gospels include two accounts of the death of Judas. The first is in the book of Matthew, and the second is in the book of Acts. The interesting thing is that these two accounts are radically different. In the book of Matthew, Judas hangs himself out of guilt. Now, none of the other three Gospels mention anything about the death of Judas except for the book of Acts, which is a sequel narrative to the four Gospels and one of the books of the New Testament. In that book, Judas dies out of the wrath of God and not out of regret. Judas died by falling down and having his body burst open with all his bowels gushed out in a field that was known to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem as Akeldama, or field of blood. Now, why was the death of Judas necessary? I believe that for the character that was invented for a limited functional reason, the character needs to exit the plot after the character arc completion. We see that in many TV productions, when a character is no longer needed in an upcoming season, it simply vanishes by getting murdered or leaving the country or whatever. Think of the dramatic exit of George O'Malley in Grey's Anatomy, after the character no longer drove major storylines. Or the death of Michael Scofield in Prison Break's finale. He dies because the story has nowhere left to go. My fourth reason of why I think Judas never existed is the textual development of the Gospels. The story of Judas was subjected to theological motivation. What I mean by that is that anyone familiar with the basics of textual analysis knows very well that the older of the four Gospels is not the same as the last of the four when it comes to theological content. A simple example of that is the way Jesus was humanly portrayed in Mark compared to how he was divinely represented in the latest book, the Gospel of John. In the book of Mark, Jesus was called Rabbi, while in John, he was repeatedly called Lord. The same thing happened with the agony of Jesus experienced in the Garden of Gethsemane. In the first books, he was distressed and fell down on his face and prayed several times. And in the later books, he prayed only once. Then in the last book, he didn't pray at all. Because by the time the last book was written, Jesus has turned into a God. And in that sense, why would God be distressed and anxious? And likewise, why would he pray? In this sense, the story of Judas strangely includes the same kind of motivation. In the first book, the death of Judas was not mentioned. Then in the book of Matthew, Judas was reported to have committed suicide out of guilt. In the book of Acts, which was written around the same time, we have a complete different story in which God is more in charge, and Judas was a part of that plan. So Judas dies out of a curse and not out of regret. You see what I'm talking about? We are not talking about two books that were written decades apart, but two documents that emerged around the same time with two different stories serving two different functions. That means that these were probably fictional compositions circulating among early Christian communities and not stories that were changed over time. Another example of the textual and theological metamorphosis of the story of Judas is the Last Supper. In the oldest book, the Gospel of Mark, Jesus does not point out who would betray him. He just prophesied that one of the disciples would. In the book of Matthew, Judas asked Jesus if it's him. Then Jesus identifies him indirectly by saying, "You have said it," and Judas has no reaction. Now fast forward to the latest and the most theologically developed book, the Gospel of John. Jesus makes a much more detailed identification of Judas, and also exhibits awareness of the upcoming arrest. "Truly, truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. The disciple whom Jesus loved was reclining next to him. Simon Peter mentioned to him to ask who Jesus meant. The beloved disciple asked, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it." So he dipped the piece of bread and gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After Judas took the bread, Satan entered him, and Jesus said, "What you're about to do, do quickly." Judas leaves immediately. You see how detailed that account was? A complete different scenario from what was in Mark. Also, the addition of Satan entered Judas is a very uncompelling interjection that forcefully frames Judas. Another thing also happened in the book of John that people rarely notice. The name of Judas changed. Unlike all the other Gospels that refer to Judas as Judas Iscariot, the book of John strictly refers to him as Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Who the hell is Simon? Another thing that was added to the book of John is a very, very interesting thing about Judas. According to the book of John, Judas was the treasurer of the group. According to John chapter 12, Judas was the group's money keeper and often stole from the shared funds, hinting at early corruption. However, not any of the three other Gospels mention anything about Judas being the treasurer of the group. The financial aspect of the activity of Judas was only covered in the book of John. A big example of how that was injected or developed in the New Testament is the story of the anointing in Bethany. In this account, a sinful woman anoints the feet of Jesus with some expensive perfume, which, according to the two earliest Gospels, got some criticism from unnamed disciples. Then in the third Gospel, the criticism was done by the Pharisee host of the dinner, Simon the Pharisee. Then in the book of John, guess who the objector was? Yes, it was Judas. Not only that, but even in the original manuscript of John, there was a further explanation of the motive of Judas's criticism of the sinful woman between brackets. I have always thought that that part was a commentary done by some translator, but not. It was in the canonical manuscript. Crazy. But Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, between brackets, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" Again, between brackets, he said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Now we see that by the end of the narrative of the last of the four Gospels, Judas is fully depicted to be the traitor of Jesus. His name is artificial, his motive is unclear, and his death couldn't be more questionable. Personally speaking, I think that the fabrication of the character of Judas was maybe done by the Romans or the temple authorities in Jerusalem to destroy the credibility and reputation of the movement of Jesus. As by attributing the arrest of Jesus to one of his followers, the credibility of the entire movement would surely get tested. And probably later, the character of this fictitious betrayer was developed further and inserted into the oral narratives that ended up written in the four Gospels decades later. That was all for today's episode. I'll be more than glad to see your opinions and interactions on the topic of this video. Make sure you leave a comment below. Thank you very much and see you soon.